Hello again. My name is Renee Conroy, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. Welcome to the third installment of the Go Outside and Play Philosophy of Aesthetics in the Natural World series that the Purdue University Northwest philosophy program has been hosting as part of our Philosophy Friday series. Today, in the third installment of 4, I'm going to introduce you to a famous aesthetic conundrum in natural aesthetics called the framing paradox. And in order to ensure that you can see the slides most readily, I'm going to move my camera slightly down to the bottom. And here we go. The framing paradox is presented by Professor Ronald Moore, who retired just a few years ago after a long and illustrious career at the University of Washington, with work in aesthetics, especially focusing on the aesthetics of nature and natural beauty, and work in the philosophy of law. He has a 2008 book called Natural Beauty, A Theory of Aesthetics Beyond the Arts, which you see behind me here. And in chapter 6 of this book, he walks us through a particular aesthetic conundrum he describes as the framing paradox. Now, the most general characterization of it, as he gives it to us right at the beginning of this chapter, is captured on the slide in front of you. He begins the chapter by saying, a standard feature of most artworks that contributes importantly to our aesthetic experience of them is the frame. But by contrast, nature can seem strikingly and importantly unframed. These are themes that I've explored in some of the previous posts, but in order just to fill out that contrast a little bit, I'm going to give you Moore's opening paragraph from chapter 6 of Natural Beauty. So here we go. A standard feature of most artworks that contributes importantly to our aesthetic experience of them is the frame. A traditional easel painting is bounded by a frame that sets limits on our range of visual attention and makes it possible to see the contents within it as intelligibly organized. Even unframed paintings are bounded by their canvas edges. Similarly, dramas, operas, dances, and various other performances are framed by the confines of their theatrical context, the proscenium arch, the amphitheater setting, the architectural backdrop, and so forth. Analogously, works of literature may be seen as framed by their covers, works of music by the temporal limits on their performance, sculptures by the dimensions of their material form, and so on. But as noted on your slide, by contrast with all of these, nature can seem strikingly and importantly unframed. When I admire the display of stars in a desert night sky, for example, there's no boundary that guides or limits my perception, except the extreme boundary of the visual horizon, and that turns out to be no boundary at all, provided I'm willing to travel far enough. When I wander through a forest, finding this or that of its myriad features beautiful, I'm not conscious of any frame that organizes them. Even if for a moment I notice the way the path opens on a lovely mountain vista caught between dense shrubbery and overhanging limbs, in the next moment I'm free to walk through the same apparent frame into a never-ending sequence of changing scenes. The same limitless of objective and malleability of perception characterize our aesthetic experience of nature from the microscopic to the telescopic scale, and from the wilderness setting to the urban setting. Art is framed, nature is not. So, with that in mind, Ron introduces us, and I'm sorry, I have a tendency to refer to Professor Moore as Ron because he was my dissertation chair. Professor Moore refers us to a conundrum that has emerged as a result of philosophers of art and philosophers of nature thinking about this tension between artworks as framed and nature as frameless. But he calls it a paradox, so let's start by taking just a minute to think about what could be meant by that. So what is a paradox? Well, in general, a paradox is a set of plausible assumptions or arguments that collectively seem to generate a contradiction, put us in a position of affirming both that A is true and A is false, or that lead to some kind of logical absurdity or some form of seemingly irresolvable logical tension. Now, the power and the puzzle of the paradox is that the premises or the preliminary arguments are very persuasive. So it's always difficult to know which one to reject or revise in an attempt to come to some kind of logical resolution. And historically, many paradoxes emphasize strictly logical concerns. We have a litany of famous philosophical paradoxes going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and before. Some you may have heard of, for example, Zeno's paradox. But often they'll fall into certain kinds of categories. So paradoxes of self-reference, and the liar's paradox, which you see here on the side of the slide, is an example of this. Paradoxes of vagueness, also called Sorites problems, or the problem of the pile or the heap. And in the 20th century, probably most famously, paradoxes that have to do with set membership, particularly Russell's paradox, which was recommended by philosopher Bertrand Russell. So to sort of see the strictly logical character of these historically famous paradoxes, just take a quick look at the cartoon of the liar's paradox here. We imagine our character on the left saying to his interlocutor, "I am lying," and the person on the right being quite puzzled with this. He says, "Well, wait, so you mean you're not lying? But then what would that mean?" And the reason there seems to be a logical tension here is because, of course, if the person on the left is being truthful when they say that they are lying, then they are actually not lying. But if the person on the left is actually lying, then they're telling the truth. Another famous version of something like the liar's paradox, or a version of the self-reference paradox, are cases in which we see something like the claim, "This sentence is false." Of course, if the sentence is false, it's true. And then if the sentence is true, it's false. So these look like very difficult, perhaps even almost irresolvable logical tensions that will require for some kind of logical resolution. But not all paradoxes have quite this strictly logical set of properties or flavor. So in contemporary philosophy, we find paradoxes of various shapes and sizes, and oftentimes they'll call for attention or raise a central issue within a particular philosophical domain, but they don't always trade in this sort of straightforward logical inconsistency or absurdity. In fact, I often think of some of these contemporary paradoxes as revealing what philosopher Robert Coburn used to describe as the strangeness of the ordinary. They encourage us to look at our pre-reflective beliefs and ferret out where there might be seeming inconsistencies in those beliefs or in how we characterize experiences or the concepts used to bound those experiences. So some examples of this strangeness of the ordinary type of paradox occur in aesthetics outside the field of philosophy of nature. Two very famous ones are often referred to as the paradox of tragedy and the paradox of feeling for fiction. The worry in the case of the paradox of tragedy is that it seems that when we engage with a dramatic work, that it's quite unpleasant in certain ways, where it has tragic incidents and characters die. We're made to feel pain of various sorts, pity for the characters, sadness, maybe fear as we imagine that their death is impending. And yet we describe all of that pain as a kind of pleasing experience. It's what makes the tragedy good. So there seems to be a puzzle here about how pain can itself be pleasing or a source of pleasure, or whether there's a kind of pleasing form of tragic pain. The paradox of feeling for fiction turns on a different kind of question. How is it possible for me to have an emotion that has a fictional character as its object? For example, to say that in another tragic drama, such as the novel Anna Karenina, I pity Anna and her situation. How is it possible for me to pity Anna, given that I know she's a fictional character, that she never really existed, that she's not suffering, and so there doesn't seem to be any genuine object for my pity. Yet despite that fact, it does seem like as I'm reading Anna Karenina, I have various emotional episodes of concern for her and emotions directed at her. So again, we get another kind of puzzle here, or a set of tensions here between things that seem to be obviously right and yet don't go together easily or readily. And in the cases of those two paradoxes, instead of the kind of formulations you might find with other historically important paradoxes, we often have them presented as a set of inconsistent propositions usually a triad. And then our job as philosophers is to figure out which of those propositions is false, because we know one of them has to be, and the difficulty turns on deciding which one it should be, or attempting to dissolve the paradox altogether. Another contemporary example that you can see an illustration of here on the slide, and I'm just going to move my camera over a little bit so that you can see the image more clearly, comes to us in the 20th century by philosopher J.L. Mackie. This one figures in Metaphysics or the Philosophy of Religion. It can be sort of articulated as a series of inconsistent propositions, but I think it's sort of more readily captured just by a question raised by Mackie. If we have in mind an omni-three God of the kind of standard Judeo-Christian conception, so one that is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, we might want to focus on one of those properties of omni, that is the omnipotence property, the property of being all-powerful. And so Mackie poses a kind of paradox, which is called the paradox of the stone, just by asking a question: can God, under that description, create a stone which he cannot lift? And you can see sort of what the problem is here. If the answer is no, then God is not all-powerful because there's something he cannot create or doesn't have the power to create. If the answer is yes, that God can create a stone that he can't lift, then you ask a second question: can God lift the stone? And if the answer is no, then again, God is not all-powerful. Why? Because now he doesn't have the power to lift something he's created. If the answer is yes, then it turns out again that God is not all-powerful. Why? Because he created a stone that he can lift, so he in fact didn't create a stone which he cannot lift. And so we get in a kind of conundrum or a net of riddles here, trying to figure out what it might mean to say that an omni-three God is omnipotent or all-powerful. And these puzzles will require untangling, even though it may not be untangling of a strictly logical character. So the framing paradox is like these kinds of puzzles. It doesn't present a strict logical conundrum, but it does present a kind of tension that calls for unraveling or untangling. And what is it? As Moore presents it, it's a kind of battle between two kinds of groups in the philosophy of nature. Those that endorse what he calls an anti-framist view in terms of how we ought to experience nature aesthetically, and those that he describes as embracing a framist view. And remember that the thing that makes this a paradox is not just that we're going to have some kind of tension, it's also that all of the assumptions that are going to be used here, or the premises and the arguments as I'll reconstruct them, seem very plausible. And so it's difficult to know which one to give up or revise. So here's the argument as it would be given from the anti-framist view. We might start with what I'm calling the proper aesthetic regard thesis. The first premise just says, so we should appreciate nature as nature, if we at least want to appreciate it in an aesthetic way that appreciates it for what it is in itself. And this has been a theme throughout the previous posts, where nature has all these features that artifacts don't seem to have in virtue of being undesigned. And so to appreciate it aesthetically, we need to appreciate it as natural rather than, say, artifactual. The second premise we might point out then is that nature is by nature frameless. We'll call this the empirical thesis. This is something that we know because we've been out in nature. We've seen those vast starry skies that Ronald Moore talks about, the great ocean, mountain vistas, and we know that there isn't anything like an art frame placed on natural environment. So when you put those two ideas together, you might come up with a conclusion like this, the anti-framist conclusion. Therefore, we should, in order to appreciate nature properly aesthetically, appreciate nature as frameless. That is, at the very least, without importing in unnatural frames into our appreciation of it, appreciating its vastness, its limitlessness, its dynamic qualities, its changing character, and the fact that it's not designed for us to look at it in this way rather than that, or from this perspective rather than that one. Now, by contrast, the framist view is one that says, actually, anti-framism may not be a tenable position. And it gets going in the following way. The framist starts off with what I'm going to call the conceptual thesis, the idea that experiencing anything as an X requires framing it. What do we mean by this? Well, if I walked out into the backyard where I have a great expanse of lawn and a lot of trees, and I didn't have any way of taking the information that's coming at me, the sensory data, the greens and the browns and the blues, and the moving bits and the static bits. If I didn't have any way of organizing those into various wholes, I would just be experiencing something like a blooming, buzzing confusion. That's a phrase from pragmatist philosopher William James. I couldn't focus on anything to appreciate it because it would just be kind of a sea of browns and greens and hues and textures. In order for me to experience nature then as having various components that are available for appreciation, this will require framing them conceptually. So now I see this bit of green as grass and that cove of green up there as leaves on individual trees. I can maybe even identify the difference between the different kinds of trees, which may affect how I regard them relative to one another. This one is particularly lush and vibrant, and that one's looking a little puny and sad given the kind of tree it is. And so in order to actually experience natural objects even as natural, I'm going to have to import some conceptual framework just to have foci of attention to appreciate. So the conclusion of the framist view is something like this. Therefore, we cannot appreciate nature as frameless. This is actually a kind of impossibility for us experientially. And that just means that to appreciate it as any kind of X at all, in order to get aesthetic appreciation of it going, we're going to have to frame our experience, the sensory data, the flying colors and textures, by means of concepts to organize things into wholes for our attention and thereby focus our attentions in various kinds of selective ways. So the paradox seems to emerge from the fact that on the one hand, the anti-framist says, in order to appreciate nature as nature, you should appreciate it as frameless, and the framist says, but we can't do that. So anti-framist, your view couldn't possibly be right because you're requiring us to do something we're unable to do. And as some of you may know from your ethics courses, in normative domains, we typically will take the sort of basic principle that ought implies can, that you can't be normatively required to do something or prescribed to do something unless it's in fact possible for you to do it. So should we be framists? Should we be anti-framists? How can we resolve the apparent tension, which is what Moore describes as the framing paradox? So here's Moore's expression of the problem, right from the text. It's a sort of much nicer way of putting it than I have on the previous slide. He says, the paradox of framing derives from the tension that this divergence of paths, that framism versus anti-framism, engenders. And we can formulate it this way. On the one hand, it seems that nothing can be comprehended as an object of attention unless it's framed or bounded in some way. But on the other hand, it seems that appreciation or appreciative experience of natural environments requires the dissolving and penetrating of all boundaries in favor of a dynamic and engaged and ever-shifting experience that will also, as we've said in previous weeks, probably be multimodal. Thus, in one sense, frames seem indispensable to aesthetic experience as a precondition of comprehensible appreciation, while in another, they impair proper regard for natural beauty, that is, for natural beauty as natural, by converting limitless sensible subjects into mere scenes or compositions. And the sort of common example that gets used to flesh out this final worry about converting a limitless sensible subject into a mere scene or composition is reflected here in the images that you have on the right of the screen. This is a modern day example of what's called a clod or a cloud glass, named after Lorraine Claude. who created it in the 18th century for the purposes of organizing natural environments into a conspectus that could then be used to create a landscape painting. And these were actually popular little devices. They looked sort of like a compact that people would actually use to appreciate nature. So they would open up the compact and there would be a mirror in it. And what they would do is they would turn their back to the natural environment and frame it in the mirror until they had just the right image of the natural scene so that it was balanced and harmonious and it exhibited a kind of maybe formal beauty that they found aesthetically compelling. So it's sort of intriguing because in using a cloud glass, you actually physically have to turn your back on nature in order to compose it as a static scene. What you see here in the image on the right is actually a contemporary version of the cloud glass that's being aimed at Tintern Abbey. And of course, unfortunately, our picture of Tintern Abbey on the top there is already framed, but you can imagine sort of walking into that pictorial frame and being in the natural environment where you would have the rolling hills all around you and many different kinds of trees. And from some vantage points, the sun would hit the abbey, reflecting some of its characteristics in this way. And another point, it would create a shadow in a different way. And so if we were in the natural environment, there would be a kind of limitless possibility of how to look at it. The image below is the same basic perspective on Tintern Abbey, excuse me, but now seen through the cloud glass. It's made completely static. We have some sort of aesthetically lovely composition here. We've got the abbey right in the middle, and it's a little bit brighter because of the convex nature of the cloud glass. Also, the sun is shining slightly differently in this image. But you also see how the person who's organized the image in the cloud glass has decided that there would be a lovely sort of additional natural framing of the abbey by just that little row of leaves of the trees on the left side that come curving down through the bushes that lead into the grasses in front of the abbey. So they've actually framed this otherwise sort of natural environment into a static composition. And this is what our anti-framists are worried about. They're worried that if we start imposing limits and frames on nature, we're going to reduce its dynamic qualities to static qualities, and we're going to make compositions that we happen to like, where those compositions or scenes might be interesting for us, they might be great for landscape painting, but they're not accurate to what nature is in itself as natural. So now here's Moore's analysis of the problem. Again, I borrow his language directly because I think it's very accessible, and it also, I think, really highlights the tension here and what he thinks the resolution to the paradox should be. So, as Moore puts it, the source of the problem, as I see it, lies in an overly narrow conception of frame that has been assumed throughout the debate. Both framists and anti-framists speak of frames as enclosing their aesthetic contents and helping to compose those contents, making possible an appreciation of their balance, unity, harmony, and so on, just as in the image of Tintern Abbey through the cloud glass on the previous slide. Framists think this is a virtue, brings out some aesthetic qualities of nature by composing it into unities. Anti-framists think it's a device, at least as applied to nature. But, Ron's analysis, neither side fully appreciates the nuanced way in which the other deals with the line between inside and outside. After all, framing can provide focus without confinement, and this is especially true when intelligence and imagination carry us beyond the immediate phenomenon, as Moore argues it ought to in many cases, both in the art world and in the natural world. So let's look a little bit at this idea of focusing without confining and having a kind of line between inside and outside. Moore gives us a couple of art examples that exhibit what I would call, and he describes elsewhere, frame permeability. And these are cases where even in engaging with an artwork that sits in a frame and has been chosen to be viewed in a frame, we are invited to immediately engage with contents beyond the frame. Understanding the work requires us to reach out to other things in the world. And he points out that iconographic works, that is religious icons that trade in symbolism, will often involve us in moving outside the immediate confine of the frame in order to understand what's inside the frame itself. So kind of frame permeability in our engagement with the work. Satires and parodies are other nice common examples of this. And I've given you a rather silly one up here in the right-hand corner. What you might recognize is that this is a parody of Grant Wood's very famous 1930 painting, American Gothic, which hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. The original painting is called American Gothic because what Wood did was created an image of a couple of people in Iowa standing in front of an Iowa piece of architecture that was described as sort of Iowa Gothic at the time. And he was envisioning what the people who lived in this farmhouse would look like. It's often misrepresented as being a picture of the farmer and his wife, but actually Grant intended it to be an image of a farmer and his daughter. So we have Grant Wood's original American Gothic, which among American artworks is either the second or third most frequently parodied. So here we see a parody, which we might call Star Wars Gothic. And immediately when you look at the parody, you are, even if it's in a specific frame hanging on a wall, encouraged to think outside that frame in order to reference what you know about American Gothic to try to make sense of how our image of Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, and Chewbacca resonates with, is analogous to, might be a comic commentary on the original Grant Wood image of the farmer and his daughter. So that's a kind of frame permeability, which means that even in the art world, we're being asked to breach this sort of inside outside of a frame all the time. So the frame is not so much a boundary or a confinement as a kind of focus for our imaginative engagement with the work. Moore also gives a really lovely example from nature. He talks about a vortex of leaves that are swirling around in an alley that calls attention to themselves, the movement of the wind, the features of the leaves for the period of time in which the vortex continues. And of course, here nature has provided us with something that we might think of as attentional foci. The way the leaves were gathered by the wind coming through a specific tunnel caused us to focus on just them for that time while they were moving. As we might in the image that I have down below here, I might get caught up because of the sort of attentional foci provided by nature itself, just in the movement and the look and the rhythm and the dynamism of the leaves, and screen out for a time, not focus for a time on the trees in the image or in the scene or in the landscape immediately behind. I might no longer notice the variegation in color in these trees, the red as opposed to the orange and bare, as opposed to things that are still green and lush. That may fall away from my attention, but the focal attention here caused by the interaction of the wind and the leaves is actually something that is provided by nature. It doesn't limit me, but it does keep my experience of that natural environment framed in a way, and maybe just for a time. So how can we take these examples and these ideas and put them together into a resolution of the paradox? Here's Moore's suggestion. He begins by considering all the ways aesthetic attention can be focused without being limited or confined. This is quite an extended part of the chapter, but I'll just focus on 3 examples that he gives. He thinks, for instance, about a hiker, as we might see in the top picture here, walking through a forest, taking perhaps a wide attention on the environment. Maybe he's trying to sort of drink it all in or be attentive to everything that's there. The beauty of its sort of hugeness and vastness is what, for a time, takes his focus. But of course, while he's walking through the forest, he can change that attentional focus from wider to narrower. Maybe he becomes simply concerned with the features of the moss and lichen on the path in front of him because he's having to walk on very carefully on uneven ground. Watch out for the slipperiness of the moss, which also may give him an opportunity to appreciate its shininess or its softness or its cushiness. And then after he's gotten through that difficult patch, perhaps the sun breaks through this foggy forest scene that I have, and a particular concatenation of leaves on a tree draw his attention for their shimmering quality or their really vibrant greenness. And so he goes then from a very narrow focus to a slightly wider one with a different focus of attention for a time, and then perhaps again back to an extremely wide one as he's coming into out of the path and into a vista that overlooks, let's say, a valley. So there can be attentional shifting throughout his walk, but also he may sort of adopt a wider set of foci and means in general than, say, someone who is a scientist who's studying a volvox colony under a microscope, where volvox is a kind of green algae. More writes about the specific aesthetic appreciative endeavors that may go on for the person who has now taken a bit of nature in order to see it, has had to frame and focus attention very, very narrowly. And as in the picture here, you might appreciate the beauty of the colors or the shapes, the variety, but uniformity, and that they're all circular in a way. You can also, though, because it's an active live colony that's dividing, find rhythm in the division process. You might find symmetry in how the division happens. You might find excitement in the speed with which the dividing happens. But all of that is seen through a very, very narrow kind of focus that's imposed by using a scientific tool like a microscope. We can imagine another similarly narrow focus that allows us to widen our vision through a telescope. And then Moore talks about a person that he describes as a gutter cleaner, someone who's cleaning out debris from, let's say, a city storm drain, who finds in the cleaning process that nature has come together in such a way that he says, I wish I could take a picture, right? So he sort of stands there and frames the setting or the scene with his hands, trying to envision what a picture would look like. And for the image that I've selected here, it looks like somebody, in fact, did this thing. They found a sweep of leaves that has its own lovely formal qualities and variegation of color in stark contrast to the hard grate with its little bit of greenness on it, and then the shimmering water up in the right-hand corner. And for a minute, took this kind of mid-range view, so not as wide as the great forest, not as narrow as the volvox under a microscope, but this kind of mid-range view that's, again, attentionally organized by natural processes themselves. The leaves have come here as a result of water pouring through the streets, pushing them down toward the drain. And so it's not failing to appreciate this conspectus of attention as natural, simply to select it or highlight it for a particular kind of regard for a time on Moore's view. So here's his resolution then to the paradox. If we think about all these different ways we could engage with nature and find aesthetic merit or aesthetic qualities in it, he concludes, from what I've said about the variability of the means by which we focus aesthetic attention in regard to natural phenomena and the variety of scope these means provide, it will be clear that the framing paradox is easily resolved in the context of appreciative practice. That's good to know. If by frame, what's really implied is the selection of this or that object or a constellation of objects for aesthetic attention, then rival claims about nature being framed and unframed can be seen as no more than variable markers on an endless scale of aesthetic selectivity, with your anti-framists at one end embracing as an aesthetic opportunity, attempting not to bring anything more to the experience than just an attempt to become wholeness with the great, wide, vast scope of the natural phenomenon, running down this continuum through all these other levels of attention, all the way down to the most highly framed kind of viewing, like the viewing under a microscope. But if anti-framism and framism lie on a continuum rather than being in tension with one another, then the paradox is resolved by shifting them to have a relationship of this kind where they're not in logical tension, but instead simply provide opposite or different kinds of equally reasonable, equally rewarding, equally aesthetically appropriate aesthetic opportunities. So thank you for joining me today. With those examples in mind, we'll have one more post in this series of Go Outside and Play, Philosophy of Aesthetics and the Natural World Philosophy Friday talks. And the next one will be on the art of nature, and we'll consider landscape artists who harness some of those things that I've given you a sort of quick look at today into what they think of as natural art or works of art made as a result of natural processes. And I hope you'll join me then. Have a wonderful day.